Here's another very interesting Navamsa chart. In fact, let me pull it up here. At first glance, you'll notice that the Karaka of the Navamsa, the most important planet, Venus, is debilitated in Virgo. So it's sleeping. And so Venus himself can't do any good. Now, the surprisingly interesting thing about Venus is that Venus is debilitated in the sign of a friend. Now that's unusual. Most planets are debilitated in signs of enemies or neutrals. Venus and Mars are the exception though. They're actually debilitated in signs of their friends. And Venus is the most surprising because he's not only debilitated in the sign of someone who's a friend to him, namely Mercury, he's also friendly towards Mercury. Now Mars is debilitated in Cancer, and the moon is his friend, but Mars is just neutral towards the moon. So the most extreme kind of debilitation case we have is Venus being debilitated in Virgo, the sign of his really bosom friend Mercury. And that will make for some surprising predictions, because when we see a debilitated planet, we automatically assume that planet to be a destructive force. Okay, because it's usually going to be starved. In most cases, it's going to be in a natural enemy sign and therefore starved. You'll remember that a planet in exaltation or Mula Trikona is in Garvita or Pradavashta. Then a planet that's in enemies Rashi is in Shuddhita or starvation. But there's no allowances made for a planet in actual debilitation. For debilitation, we have to take the Lord of the sign and see if it's a friend or not. So Mars and Venus, when they're in the signs of their debilitation, they actually, while they have no power of their own, they actually can be delighted on account of their friend. Okay? So whenever you see, so because of that, you'll often see debilitated Mars or debilitated Venus give better results than you expected. You won't see that with debilitated Saturn, debilitated Sun, planets that are debilitated in signs of their natural enemies, unless they just have so many friends helping them out. But when Venus or Mars is debilitated, it doesn't take much to turn them around into productive things. Now, they're still debilitated, which means the planet itself is sleeping. It's unconscious. It's not going to be able to do anything. But really easily, its friends can help it out, okay? And it doesn't start with a deficit. A planet that's in a natural enemy sign starts with a huge deficit. Venus and Mars, when they're debilitated, they don't start with a deficit. They start at ground zero, which means we have to weigh the favorable, friendly and the unfavorable, unfriendly influences on them. So in this chart, Venus is in the sign of a friend, though debilitated. So Venus is sleeping, can't do anything by himself. He's not going to be able to help out any bhavas he influences. He's going to hurt the bhavas he influences because he's debilitated. He's inauspicious in that way. But he still may be able to produce his own things if he has enough friends helping him out. Mercury, who's the friend that owns the sign Venus is in, is exalted in Virgo in the Navamsa. So that makes Venus really strong, very much more capable, because Mercury is basically bailing Venus out and giving it a lot of power. Venus is starting at zero, and now it's getting a big dose of Mercury-friendly influence. And that's because Mercury rules the sign of Venus. Okay? Then Venus is aspected by its enemy moon, but just to a very mediocre 6 points, not enough to really matter, by neutral Mars, neutral Jupiter, and then by friend Saturn, who's extremely strong in the Navamsa by being in its own sign. He's at the end of Capricorn, so he's not as strong as he could be. He's getting towards the end, but he's in good dignity. So he's got a strong friend helping him and a strong, friendly Lord, with just a little bit of Shuddhita, starvation, coming from the moon. Okay? So this is actually a good Venus, meaning this Venus will produce. Okay? Now, it's still debilitated though. It's still what we call Nietzsche, or low. And what debilitated planets give low things. Okay? Exalted planets, which is Ucha, which means high, they give high things. So that means when Venus is debilitated, people do low things in their marriage life. They do things that are abnormal, okay, or which society frowns upon, which are not considered as role models. This person has only had one love, okay, and they had that love from when they were young, and they acted upon that love when they were 17, when they were in Venus Dasha, and they married that love 6 years later, and they've been happily married ever after. So it sounds like the perfect story. First love, gets together at 17, marries at 23, has had a great marriage so far. But it's still debilitated Venus. Okay, now it was actually Venus Mercury is when they acted upon the love. Makes sense, right? Mercury rules Venus. Mercury is exalted, so it's Garvita, it's proud. Now Mercury gets hurt by the moon. It's a natural enemy. But the moon's just in a neutral sign, so he's not that powerful to hurt. He's only half powerful to hurt Mercury. Then Mercury's aspected by neutral Jupiter, friend Venus, but Venus can't help. And then Mercury is hurt by the Sun's conjunction in the Rashi chart. And the Sun is in a neutral sign, in a natural friend sign, so he has 50% power to hurt. So Mercury's mediocre, but he's still the Lord of Venus. And the Antardasha Lord, when it rules the Dasha Lord, is always an important time. In this case, Mercury is exalted, even though he's with the Sun. Okay? So in Mercury, Venus Mercury is when he acts upon that love that he's had a few years, when he was the age of 17. Now the part that's debilitated, that's low of Venus, the unusual thing that society would not want to follow in general as a role model, is that the woman he fell in love with was his mother's best friend, who was, at the time, 20 years older than him. Okay? So he falls in love with a woman who's 20 years older than him, and he's only 17. So it's also illegal, right? And he initiated. She had no idea that he had this affection for her for years, until one day he just came up behind her and gave her a hug. And she thought at first that he was just goofing off and like wrestling her, playing like kids will play. But when she turned around and looked at him, she got this totally different feeling and realized that he was like really in love with her. Okay? And so it's not an ideal role model. Children should not be falling in love with their parents' best friend. In general, that's really, really not going to work. But in this person's case, it really, really has worked, due to the fact that, Venus is actually in really great shape. It's very delighted. And the relationship started in Venus Dasha under Mercury, who's the planet that's delighting Venus the most, because Venus being in that natural friend sign. Okay? So, how good is it? Well, when you look at these two people, say they were walking down the street, you would think they belong with each other. At 17, 20, the guy looked like he was in his 30s. Okay? He looks older. He's a huge guy. He's like, a 300-pound dude, and he's strong as a bull, but he's also just one of those big sumo wrestler type builds. He's sort of fat in a way, but it's all hard tissue. It's not like flabby fat. The guy's just this big, huge guy that looks a lot older. And she's a very elegant, tall woman who looks a lot younger. So when you look at them, they look like they belong together. They don't look like she's a cradle robber. He doesn't look 10 years younger than her. He doesn't look any younger than her. They look the same age, actually. And they've had a great relationship. So this is a case where Venus gave a wonderful relationship, even though it was debilitated, because it's a good Venus. But it still gave a relationship that society in general would frown upon. Venus debilitating the Navamsa gives weird things like that, affairs, inappropriate romances, and usually they lead to disaster. But this Venus is so well supported by two strong friends, Mercury and Saturn. And this is also a really good example of how Saturn aspecting Venus can really help Venus have a good relationship. But it is a good relationship. It's worked. Okay, now let's look at some of the other factors, the other relationship factors in this chart. I started with Venus. Venus is most important, but also they were running Venus Dasha when the relationship started. Okay, Venus we've seen is great. The ninth lord is Jupiter. Okay, Jupiter is sleeping in Venus's sign, so he's in a natural enemy sign. But Venus is debilitated, so Jupiter can't get starved by being there. But Jupiter has no strength to do anything by himself because he is sleeping. But Venus can't take from him. It's like if you're in the dungeons of Venus, you're stuck. You can't do anything. But if Venus is sleeping, Venus isn't going to be torturing you and draining the blood out of you and trying to figure out where your money is and stealing it. Okay? He's basically leaving you alone. So Jupiter doesn't get starved, but he's completely can't do anything himself either because he's sleeping. But Jupiter picks up some strength by being aspected by the Sun, his friend, by Mars, his friend, and Mars is very strong by being in its own house, but it's a little bit of a weak influence, by Mercury, his enemy, by Saturn, his neutral, Venus, his enemy, who's sleeping. So just Jupiter actually gets a little teensy bit of delight. It's a mediocre, average ninth lord. It's not great. It's not terrible. Okay? Now, Jupiter, however, will hurt the Navamsa as a Varga because he's in a great enemy sign. He's in bad dignity here. Okay? And being in bad dignity, over here in a great enemy sign, he's going to drain the Bhavasi aspect. So he's not a helpful planet, but as ninth lord, he's totally fine. Now the ninth Bhava is aspected by the Sun in a neutral sign, who's not going to therefore help, by Mars in own sign, who will help, by Mercury in exaltation, who will help, by debilitated Venus, which will hurt the ninth house, and by friend Saturn, who will help. So that debilitated Venus is going to take a lot out of this ninth house, unfortunately. And so the ninth house, even with the nice helpful aspect of two strong planets, Saturn and Mars, and a decent planet, Venus, comes out to be, decent planet, Sun, comes out to be a hair less than great, than mediocre. Okay, it's a little bit under mediocre. It's a very mediocre, little shabby ninth house. Okay, which means that the dashas of bad planets afflicting the ninth house can take its toll eventually. Okay, after Venus, they had Sun dasha, which is helping the ninth house. After Sun dasha, they had Moon dasha, which isn't influencing the ninth house. Okay. And the other thing they have, Jupiter is conjunct the ninth cusp in the Navamsa, so it's helping the ninth house in the Navamsa to 1 point, because it's in a great enemy sign in the Navamsa. That means it's going to help the ninth to just 1 point, not very much, okay? But there's a little bit of strength there, but not much. It's a mediocre one. In the dashas of other planets, it can hurt that. Now, they started their relationship in Venus Dasha. In Venus Mercury, because Venus was the Karaka, the relationship was given. But it was a treacherous time during those 3 years. They were still adjusting it. Venus, the woman, was in shock about being in love with this young guy who didn't have any financial prospects, who was broke all the time, and she didn't want to just raise another kid. She didn't want to raise an 18-year-old. She wanted a real man. So during those 3 years of Venus Dasha, it was very stressful for them. And then they came to me, he came to me 2 months before his Sun Dasha, and he complained about how his girlfriend was nagging him and always complaining about him not making money, and she didn't like what he was doing for work. It wasn't really steady employment. And you'll see in the Rasi chart he has Venus in the third house, which Venus doesn't do well in the third house, doesn't produce a lot of great results usually, just in general. And then there are some problems with Venus in other places. And we had no prospects, He just had average grades when he graduated. He was 23 at the time, so he, just been kind of drifting, working odd jobs, not making any money since he graduated. No, he was 21 at the time. Okay. Was he 20? Yeah, he was just 20, about to turn 21. I said, when Sun Dasha comes, you're going to make plenty of money. I said, I don't know how you're going to do it, because I don't see you having any prospects in your future. You've got no prospects. And we both just laughed. I said, but I swear you are going to make money as soon as that Sun Dasha starts. Sun Dasha came along. I saw him 3 months after the Sun Dasha started, and he was driving a BMW. His girlfriend was happy as pie. And he had just gotten this job selling something. As it turned out, he ended up being this ace salesperson, and in the first month of working there, he was sold more product than anyone else in the company. In a short time, within a year, he's like vice president of this company, and just rocked throughout his Sun Dasha. Okay, now that's another prediction of why that happened. But the point I'm wanting to make is that Venus Dasha was stressful for this path. He didn't feel secure on this path. His wife didn't feel secure on this marital path. But because Venus was hurting the ninth house, which is that, the house of being on the path. And really, they, all the time they're talking about breaking up, he felt like he couldn't provide for her, and he knew she really wanted it, and he felt bad about that. She didn't feel like he could ever provide, and she didn't want to have a burden at the age of 40 of raising basically a 20-year-old who had no financial prospects. But Venus as a Karaka was well supported by his friends Mercury and friend Saturn, so they appreciated enough about each other to hang in there. And then Sun Dasha came along, and a good sun can always give marriage. In this chart, the sun is one of the planets helping the ninth bhava. Okay, the sun is helped by he's in a natural friend sign, so he's delighted. His natural friend Mars is very strong, so he gets a lot of benefit from Mars. He's helped by natural friend Sun. He's hurt by enemy Saturn and enemy Venus, but not as much as Moon and Mars are helping him, especially because Mars is not just helping to 8 points. Mars is helping to a full value because he's in its own Rashi, he's awake, and he rules the Sun. So Sun Dasha gives the marriage, and they got married in Sun Dasha. Okay? And the relationship got better the minute Sun Dasha came into play. When Sun Dasha started, their relationship got focused, and they focus on getting a house together and really focused in on the long term. So Venus being debilitated and hurting the ninth house was making that path very scary and insecure. But as a Karaka, it held them together, It just didn't crystallize until that full commitment because Venus was hurting that ninth house. Okay, the other important house is the third bhava. The third bhava here is Virgo, ruled by Mercury, exalted. Okay, so the Lord of the third is Garvita. The third Lord Mercury is hurt by the moon, unfortunately, and hurt by just the moon. Is that right? Oh, and it's also hurt by the sun because it's conjunct it. So the third Lord has its issues on it, but at least it starts Garvita proud, which takes a lot to totally drain that planet. So it ends up being a mediocre third Lord. Okay? The third cusp itself is aspected by a really nice and strong Mars, a nice and strong Saturn, so it gets a lot of strength from Saturn and Mars. So this gives, perseverance, Saturn, and then Mars, that logical, let's not make things bigger deal than they are, and that strength of character, which can really help us, that noble strength of character that really helps us deal with people. A good third house with a good Mars, influence to it is like that noble quality of how we deal with other people. The ninth house is what we believe in, but actually practicing the ninth house is the third house. So people might believe in virtue because they have a good ninth, but if they have a bad third house, they'll do selfish things. If they have a good third house and a good Mars, they'll behave more nobly. So this person has some good things to the third house. He does have some problems to it, namely the conjunct Venus, which is debilitated. So that gets rid of one of these planets, basically trashes the influence of Saturn. But they still get to come ahead because of Mars. Two really good, strong planets. So the third bhava comes out to be a bit better than its worst. So it's average. So an average third house, average third lord, average ninth house. But the dashas have been in their favor. They had a good sun dasha. Sun dasha that supported marriage. A moon dasha that supported marriage. Okay? Now you see, moon is in Scorpio, where people consider it debilitated. But according to Parashara, my belief is the moon is only debilitated in the first 3 degrees of Scorpio. They made it through their marriage no problem. And if your moon is debilitated in the Navamsa, it becomes really, really hard to make it through that dasha with a marriage. And they did it quite happily, in fact, because the moon's in a natural friend sign, and Mars is really strong, so it gets a lot of delight from Mars. And now they're in Mars dasha. Mars is a strong planet in the Navamsa. It rules the 7th house, which is the gains from the Navamsa, the benefit of the Navamsa, a good partnership. Mars is influenced by its friend Sun, its friend Moon. It's hurt by Mercury, but that's it. Otherwise, it's good and solid. So it's a nice, strong Mars. So marriage is going to be great throughout Mars dasha too. No worries there. So here's a person with debilitated Venus who's going to make it, to the age of, let's see here, let me do the math. The age of 43 with just one woman. And not just one marriage, but one woman. His first love, all the way to the age of 43, is going to be quite happy. Okay? Now after that, he's going to go into Rahu period. Okay? Once Rahu period starts, his wife is going to be in her 60s. Okay? And we can see some potential problem with Rahu. She'll be in her early 60s because Rahu's in the 6th house. So that can indicate some possible problems with the spouse. Rahu's Lord Venus is debilitated. Okay, which means Rahu's going to give some more tricky stuff. Rahu dasha is 18 years long. His wife is not going to live through Rahu dasha. She's not going to make it. So she's going to die in Rahu dasha. His spouse will leave him in Rahu due to death, most likely. So we do have some problems in the future, but Rahu won't cause a marriage that ends in, Rahu won't cause a marriage that ends in a divorce. They won't divorce or anything during that time. She'll pass from natural causes in Rahu dasha. So this is a person who's got a one marriage chart, even though he has a debilitated Venus. And not even one marriage, a one woman chart, even though he has a debilitated Venus. So when you see that debilitated Venus, you got to look at things carefully. See if Venus is getting saved. If Venus has a strong impact of the moon, or Venus is conjunct the sun in the Rashi chart, then Venus is being debilitated is going to give huge problems. Okay? Because then it's either agitated by the sun, or if it's aspected by the sun, which starves Venus, or actually agitates Venus too, or if the moon influences Venus, that's really problematical, actually, as I've talked about. But in this person's case, none of that happens. It's free from that. So the most damaging things to ruining your happiness in marriage, or you're ruining your Venus, are conjunctions of Saturn or aspects or conjunctions of the sun or moon. That's what causes Venus to really create a lot of suffering and unhappiness in your love life. Okay? But if got Saturn or Mercury influencing Venus, that makes such a huge difference in that. And this is a really good example chart for that, for that type of thing. Okay, so this is a surprising, very interesting chart, and it has a lot of subtleties that are really not subtleties. There are really clear rules from Parashara. A planet is starved when it's in an enemy sign, not when it's in debilitation. When it's in a debilitation, it's sleeping. Therefore, it can't do anything based on its own merit. Okay? And the interesting thing, Venus in a man's chart is the woman, the wife. And she was sleeping. She had no idea he was in love with her. He totally is the one that made everything happen. He's the one that initiated it. He's the one that went after her. He's the one that committed himself to her. He's the one that provided, and got work and figured out how to get a BMW and buy her a big house in Southern California. All this because he loved her so much that he wanted to give her everything she wanted. Where she didn't try to increase her business so that they could have a more wealthy life. She was the sleeping person. But still the right partner for him due to that good influences to Venus. You see a strong Mercury, which is a really great level of friendship between the couple. You see a strong Saturn, which is a healthy detachment and acceptance that makes a relationship work. And because it aspects Venus, an appreciation of what's real and what they really have and of its true value. Without Saturn aspecting Venus, it's so easy to start believing that the grass is greener on the other side of somebody else's bed. Okay? But Saturn aspecting Venus really makes you appreciate your partner and your marriage. So it's really, really a helpful thing. Of course, Saturn conjunct Venus does the opposite, makes you starved for affection and love, and therefore ruins your marriage. So this is actually a very good Navamsa of a person who's been focused on wanting a life with this woman, and only this woman, from the age of 17 onwards, when Venus-Mercury Dasha started. Okay? Alright, enough said on this chart. I hope you find this example interesting and that it keeps your eyes open when you see a debilitated Venus, and for that matter, a debilitated Mars as well. Okay? Or any planet that's debilitated and not in an enemy sign. It could get saved. Even though that planet itself will still hurt the bhavas it influences. So it's never ideal to have it debilitated. Okay? But if it is, it can still produce some great results if it gets the help it needs. Okay, thank you.